Close your eyes, if you are able to do so, and let your body settle into whatever surface holds you now, whether it is a bed, a couch, a chair worn soft by long use, or simply the quiet floor of a room that belongs entirely to you in this moment. Let your shoulders drop, let your jaw loosen, let the muscles behind your eyes release, one by one, like small knots of rope slowly coming undone in warm water. There is nothing you need to do tonight. There is nowhere you need to go. There is no task waiting for you that cannot wait a little longer still. You have arrived at the end of your day, and the end of your day is gentle and still, and without urgency, and all that remains now is the slow drift towards sleep. Tonight, we are going to travel together, you and I, through a great stretch of human history, through centuries and continents, through candlelit rooms and fog-wrapped city streets, through the quiet wards of old hospitals and the mountain retreats, where the sick were sent to breathe cold, clean air, through the lives of poets and painters and physicians, through the long, slow story of a disease that humanity has carried with it since before recorded memory, a disease called tuberculosis, called consumption, called the White Plague, called phthisis by the ancient Greeks, called by so many names across so many generations that the names themselves become like a lullaby, a soft and sorrowful catalogue of human suffering and human endurance. If this voice helps you rest, consider subscribing to Plague Lullaby, but only if you are still awake. For now, settle deeper into your pillow and let us drift back through time together. Back through the centuries, back through the millennia, to a world far older than anything we can remember, where the same quiet disease was already at work, already moving through human lungs, already shaping human lives in ways that would echo forward softly, softly, all the way to us. It is worth noting, as we begin our long and gentle journey, that tuberculosis is among the oldest diseases known to have accompanied the human species through its time. Upon this earth, a companion so ancient and so persistent that it seems almost woven into the very fabric of what it means to be mortal and breathing. The earliest physical evidence of tuberculosis in human remains comes from the archaeological record of ancient Egypt, where mummified bodies dating to approximately 3,400 years before the Common Era have been found to bear the distinctive lesions of the disease, the small calcified nodules, and the characteristic damage to bone and lung tissue that physicians across many centuries have learned to recognize as the signature of a specific and patient killer. Among the most striking of these ancient cases are the skeletal remains of individuals who appear to have suffered from what is now called Pott's disease, a form of tuberculosis that affects the spine, causing the vertebrae to collapse inward and producing the characteristic curved posture, the forward bend of the back that ancient Egyptian tomb artists rendered in sculpture and relief. The hunchbacked figures who appear in the art of the pharaonic era and who carry in their bodies, even across 4,000 years, the evidence of a disease that was already ancient when they lived. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving medical documents in the world, composed around 1550 before the Common Era, describes treatments for ailments of the lung that bear a close resemblance to what we would now recognize as pulmonary tuberculosis. And though the ancient Egyptian physicians did not, of course, understand the bacterial nature of what they were treating, their careful observations of symptoms, the persistent cough, the gradual wasting of the body, the blood that sometimes appeared, speak to a clinical reality that has remained unchanged across the full span of recorded human time. Meanwhile, in the ancient civilizations of the Indian subcontinent, Sanskrit texts from the Vedic period, composed perhaps as long ago as 1500 before the Common Era, describe a condition called Rajayakshma, a word sometimes translated as the king of diseases, that presents with symptoms closely matching those of pulmonary tuberculosis, including the chronic cough, the fever that comes and goes, the slow and inexorable loss of weight and strength. The ancient writers of India already understood, in a broad and intuitive sense, that this disease had something to do with closeness, with living in confined spaces, with the shared breath of people pressed together in city and household, and their writings recommend isolation, clean air, and careful diet as the closest things they had to treatment. Recommendations that would, remarkably, still be echoing through the advice of physicians nearly 3,000 years later. In ancient China, the Huangdi Neijing, the Yellow Emperor's Classics of Medicine, a foundational text of Chinese medical thought, compiled over several centuries, before and after the start of the Common Era, also describes a wasting disease of the lung that historians and physicians have since identified as likely referring to tuberculosis, using the Chinese term fei liao, or lung exhaustion, to capture the essential quality of a disease that seemed to hollow its sufferers out from within, leaving behind a person who was recognizably themselves, but diminished, lighter, somehow less present in the world. It is a quiet thing to contemplate as you lie here in the dark, that these ancient physicians in Egypt, in India, in China, in Greece, separated by thousands of miles and centuries of time, were all observing the same small organism at work, in the same human body, though they would not know this, could not have imagined the word bacterium, could not have pictured the slender, slightly curved rod-shaped creature that was the true architect of all this sorrow. They saw only the suffering and tried, with great care and with the knowledge available to them, to offer some relief. And in the trying they were already part of the long, slow story of medicine and tuberculosis, a story that would take thousands of years more to reach anything like resolution. Meanwhile, across the ancient Mediterranean world, in the city-states of Greece, and in the libraries of Alexandria, other physicians were adding their careful observations to the record. And it is to the writings of ancient Greece that we must turn next to find the next chapter of this long and patient history. The ancient Greeks gave tuberculosis the name by which it would be known throughout the classical world and well into the medieval period, calling it phthisis, from the Greek word meaning to waste or to decay, a word that captures beautifully the essential quality of the disease as it presented itself to observation in a time before microscopes. And bacterial theory, when all that a physician could do was watch and record what the body did as the illness progressed. Hippocrates of Cos, who lived from approximately 460 to 377 years before the Common Era, and who is remembered as one of the founding figures of Western medicine, wrote extensively about phthisis in the collection of texts known as the Hippocratic Corpus, a body of medical writing assembled over several centuries, and attributed with varying degrees of accuracy to Hippocrates and his school. In these texts, tuberculosis is described with a clinical precision that is genuinely remarkable for its era. The physicians of the Hippocratic tradition, noting the chronic cough that was worse at night, and in the cool months of autumn and winter, the sputum that was sometimes tinged or streaked with blood, the cheeks that became flushed with a hectic fever, while the rest of the face grew pale and hollowed, the eyes that acquired a peculiar brightness, a feverish luminosity that observers would describe again and again across the centuries, in medical texts and in poetry and in the letters of those who sat by the bedsides of the dying. Hippocrates noted that phthisis was most common among the young, particularly those between the ages of 18 and 35, and that it tended to cluster in households and in communities, appearing to run in families, a pattern that later generations would interpret as evidence of hereditary predisposition, but that reflected, at least in part, the simple reality of transmission by shared air in shared spaces. He also noted that pregnancy seemed to worsen the disease, a clinical observation that physicians would continue to make for the next 2,000 years, without being able to explain the mechanism, and that certain environmental conditions, the cold, damp air of cities in winter, the close quarters of crowded housing, seemed to be associated with higher rates of the illness. The Hippocratic treatment for phthisis was built around the principles that would remain central to tuberculosis care for millennia, namely rest, fresh air, nourishing food, and the avoidance of cold and damp. And while these prescriptions could not cure the disease, they were not without some basis in a kind of intuitive wisdom, since rest and good nutrition do support the immune response. And fresh air does reduce the concentration of infectious particles in the environment around a sick person. It is worth pausing to appreciate the quiet thoughtfulness of these ancient physicians, working without any of the conceptual tools that modern medicine takes for granted, yet arriving through careful observation at recommendations that contained, buried within them, seeds of genuine therapeutic wisdom, even if the full flowering of that wisdom would have to wait for the revolution in bacteriology that was still more than 2,000 years away. Over the course of the centuries that followed, Hippocrates, Greek, and then Roman physicians continued to study phthisis, adding their observations to the accumulated record of the disease. And among the most thorough of these ancient clinicians was Soranus of Ephesus, who lived and practiced in the 2nd century of the Common Era, and whose writings on pulmonary consumption were so detailed and so accurate that modern physicians reading them have expressed genuine admiration for the precision of his clinical eye. Meanwhile, the Roman physician Claudius Galen, who practiced in the 2nd century, and whose ideas about medicine would dominate Western medical thought for over 1,000 years, wrote about phthisis as a disease arising from an ulcerated state of the lung, a condition caused, he believed, by an imbalance among the 4 bodily humours, the ancient Greek and Roman framework of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile that served as the foundational theory of all disease in classical medicine. Galen's understanding of tuberculosis was, in the terms of modern bacteriology, entirely incorrect, and yet his observations of symptoms were often strikingly accurate, and his recommendations for treatment, which emphasized rest, mild exercise, nourishing food, sea air, and mountain air, would not have seemed out of place in a Victorian sanatorium 18 centuries later. The afternoon of the ancient world was already long and shadowed by tuberculosis, and as the Roman Empire declined, and the centres of learning and literacy contracted, the careful observations of the Hippocratic and Galenic physicians were preserved in manuscripts that moved slowly through the monasteries of medieval Europe and the libraries of the Islamic world, carrying within them the quiet legacy of a disease that had never stopped its patient work among the living. Through the long centuries of the medieval period in Europe, tuberculosis continued its unhurried passage through human populations, and the understanding of the disease, at least in the formal written record that has come down to us, remained largely within the framework established by the ancient Greeks and elaborated by Galen, a framework that described the wasting sickness of the lung as arising from internal imbalance, from constitutional weakness, from the corrupting influence of bad air, or from a spiritual dimensions of suffering that the medieval Christian worldview was well equipped to accommodate. During this period, tuberculosis of the lymph nodes, a form of the disease in which the lymph glands of the neck become enlarged and may eventually break through the skin, was known by a distinct name, scrofula, from the Latin word for a brood sow, a name that referred perhaps to the clustered, pig-like appearance of the enlarged nodes, and scrofula was distinguished in medieval medical thought from phthisis proper, though both conditions were, as we now know, caused by the same organism. Scrofula acquired, during the medieval period, a remarkable association with royalty, being known across France and England as the King's Evil, based on a belief that had become firmly established by at least the 10th or 11th century that the touch of a crowned and anointed king possessed the power to cure those who suffered from this disease of the lymph glands. The royal touch for scrofula became one of the most enduring and widespread medical rituals of the medieval and early modern period, practiced by the kings and queens of France and England for centuries, with records suggesting that the French King Philip I began the practice in the 11th century, and that it continued in England until the reign of Queen Anne, who was said to have touched the young Samuel Johnson for scrofula in 1712, an event that Johnson himself later recorded in his memoirs with a kind of wondering nostalgia. Though the touch did not, of course, cure him. Meanwhile, in the great cities of medieval and early modern Europe, where populations were growing, and where the conditions of urban life, the crowded tenements, the narrow streets through which little air moved freely, the poor nutrition, and the cold and damp of winter were all conducive to the spread of a respiratory pathogen. Tuberculosis was quietly becoming more prevalent, moving through communities where close quarters and shared breath made transmission both easy and inevitable, though the people of that era had no framework in which to understand why the disease seemed to cluster in certain households and certain neighborhoods. The monasteries and convents of medieval Europe were themselves significant sites of tuberculosis, since the communal life of religious orders, with monks and nuns sleeping in shared dormitories, eating together, praying together in enclosed chapels, provided ideal conditions for the spread of a respiratory illness, and the historical record includes numerous accounts of entire religious communities being devastated by outbreaks of what the records call pulmonary consumption, with the quiet repetition of illness and death in the cloister becoming a kind of background grief in the life of medieval religious communities. It is worth noting that the medieval understanding of tuberculosis, incorrect as it was in its fundamental premises, was not without a kind of moral and spiritual depth, since the experience of a long and wasting illness was understood within the Christian framework as an opportunity for the purification of the soul, a slow burning away of earthly attachments, and the consumptive who died young and beautiful and pale was seen, in this light, as someone who had been refined by suffering, whose illness had made them, in some essential sense, more spiritual, more transparent to grace, a perception that would find its secular equivalent centuries later, in the Romantic movement's association of tuberculosis with artistic sensitivity and transcendent beauty. Slowly, through the 15th and 16th centuries, as the Renaissance brought a renewed interest in empirical observation and in the careful study of anatomy and disease, physicians began to look more critically at the Galenic inheritance, and certain writers began to propose, tentatively, that some diseases, might spread from person to person through some kind of contagion, a living particle or seed passed from the sick to the well through contact or through the air. Among the most important of these early contagion theorists was the Italian physician Girolamo Fracastoro, who in 1546 published a work called De Contagione et Contagiosis Morbis, in which he proposed that diseases could spread through seeds of disease, which he called seminaria morbi, tiny particles that could be transmitted by direct contact, by objects that had been in contact with the sick, or at a distance through the air, a theory that was startlingly close to the germ theory of disease that would not be fully established for another 3 centuries, and which, when applied to tuberculosis, suggested that the clustering of the disease in households and communities was not merely a matter of shared constitution or shared misfortune, but of something passing between people, something invisible and yet material, a subtle living thing. Over the next century and a half, as Europe moved through the 17th century and into the 18th, tuberculosis underwent a transformation in its social and demographic significance that would make it, by the early decades of the industrial era, the single greatest cause of death in the cities of the Western world. A distinction it would hold with terrible consistency for the better part of 200 years. The processes that drove this transformation were themselves slow and inexorable, as large as history, as quiet as the turning of seasons. And they were rooted in the profound changes that the Industrial Revolution was beginning to work upon the landscape and the population of England and subsequently of Europe and North America. As the 18th century progressed, the movement of rural populations into cities accelerated dramatically, drawing workers from the countryside into the factories and mills of Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, and London, concentrating thousands and then tens of thousands of people in neighborhoods, built quickly and cheaply with little thought for ventilation or sanitation or the simple human need for space and light and clean air. In these densely packed urban environments, where a single room might house an entire family, and where the walls of adjacent tenements stood so close, together that sunlight barely reached the street below, Mycobacterium tuberculosis found conditions so favorable to its spread that the disease began to achieve a kind of terrible prevalence that the earlier centuries had not seen, or at least had not recorded in such stark demographic terms. The historian Thomas McCone, writing in the 20th century, estimated that tuberculosis may have been responsible for as much as 1/4 of all deaths in England in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. A figure that, if it lands gently on the ear at this late hour, nevertheless represents an almost unimaginable weight of grief spread across thousands of families, in thousands of streets, in every city in the land. By the late 18th century, 1 citizen in 4 was dying of tuberculosis in London. A statistic recorded in the bills of mortality that were published week by week and year by year, those quiet ledgers of the dead that Samuel Johnson and his contemporaries could consult to learn how many of their fellow Londoners had succumbed that week to consumption, and how many to fever, and how many to smallpox. The great catalogue of mortality laid out in plain figures, with a matter of factness that reflects, perhaps, the degree to which death was simply a more visible and ordinary presence in daily life during this era than it has become in the centuries since. During this period, tuberculosis was known almost universally in the English-speaking world, not as tuberculosis, but as consumption, a word of great descriptive accuracy, since the disease does, in its slow and patient way, seem to consume its host, burning through the body's reserves of flesh and energy over months and years, leaving behind a person who is thinner and paler and weaker with each passing season until the reserves are exhausted and the body can sustain the effort no longer. The name consumption carried within it a whole aesthetic and emotional universe that the more clinical term tuberculosis would later displace. And in the century between roughly 1750 and 1850, the consumptive was a recognizable and deeply familiar figure in the social landscape of England, France, and the other urbanizing nations of the Western world. A young person, more often than not, growing gradually pale and thin, coughing at odd moments, running a fever in the afternoons, existing in a kind of intermediate state between full health and death that could stretch over years, and that was attended by both great sorrow and, increasingly, a peculiar and troubling aesthetic fascination. It is worth pausing here, in the quiet of this late hour, to let the weight of that social reality settle gently. The knowledge that in the cities of the early industrial period, consumption was not a rare or unusual affliction, but a constant presence in ordinary life, known in almost every family, mourned in almost every neighborhood, shaping the emotional and cultural life of an entire civilization, in ways that we are only now, at this distance, fully beginning to understand. It was during the late 18th century and the early decades of the 19th that consumption began its remarkable transformation from a disease of the poor and the crowded into something that the culture of Romanticism would invest with a strange and melancholy beauty, a disease that was, paradoxically, and yet very distinctly, fashionable, associated not only with suffering and death, but with sensitivity, with artistic genius, with a kind of luminous and fragile transcendence that set the consumptive apart from the merely healthy and the merely ordinary. The roots of this association were complex and ran through several different streams of cultural and social thought, but among the most important was the simple and melancholy fact that tuberculosis killed a striking number of the most celebrated artists, poets, and musicians of the Romantic era, so many that the disease became, in the popular imagination, inseparable from the artistic temperament itself, as though the same qualities of soul that produced great poetry or great music also rendered the body vulnerable to consumption, as though genius and illness were two aspects of the same essential difference from the common run of humanity. John Keats, who was born in London in 1795, and who trained as a surgeon before devoting himself entirely to poetry, contracted tuberculosis and died in Rome on February 23, 1821, at the age of 25, leaving behind a body of poetry that is now considered among the finest in the English language. And the story of his death, of his removal to the warmer climate of Rome in the hope that the Italian air might ease his condition, of his recognition on seeing blood on his handkerchief that he was dying, a recognition he expressed in words that were recorded and preserved with great care by those who loved him, became one of the defining images of romantic mortality, the young genius consumed by the same fire that animated his art. The poet Lord Byron, who watched the world of romanticism around him fill up with consumptives, expressed what was perhaps the most precise and most disturbing formulation of the romantic attitude toward tuberculosis, when he said, or was reported to have said, that he should like to die of consumption, because, as he put it, all the women would say, "See that poor Byron, how interesting he looks in dying," a remark that captures, with Byron's characteristic mixture of vanity and self-awareness, the degree to which consumption had become aestheticized in the cultural imagination of his era, associated with a particular kind of beauty, the beauty of pallor and thinness and fragility, of bright eyes and flushed cheeks, and a luminous, feverish quality that the romantic sensibility found deeply appealing. Frédéric Chopin, the Polish composer and pianist who spent much of his adult life in Paris, and who died in that city on October 17, 1849, at the age of 39, suffered from tuberculosis for a large part of his adult life, and the relationship between his illness and his music became, for the cultural imagination of the 19th century, a kind of emblem of the consumptive artist, the person in whom suffering and creativity were so closely intertwined that they seemed to feed one another, the illness intensifying the sensitivity finding its expression in music of extraordinary delicacy and emotional depth. The Bronte sisters, Charlotte and Emily and Anne, who grew up in the parsonage at Haworth in Yorkshire, and who produced, in the 1840s, some of the most enduring novels in the English language, were all touched by tuberculosis, Emily dying of the disease in December of 1848 at the age of 30, and Anne following her in May of 1849 at the age of 29, the two sisters dying within 6 months of each other, while Charlotte, who would herself die in 1855, though from a different cause, watched and grieved and continued to write. Meanwhile, the aesthetic of tuberculosis was not confined to the artists who died of it, but had spread outward into the broader culture, shaping ideals of beauty and fashion in ways that seem, from the vantage point of our own era, both strange and deeply revealing, for the pallid, thin, feverish appearance of the consumptive had become, by the 1820s and 1830s, an ideal of feminine beauty in fashionable society. Women whitening their faces with powder and sometimes with arsenic to achieve the consumptive complexion, lacing their corsets to produce the narrow waist and the slightly breathless quality associated with the disease, adopting the languorous, reclining pose of the invalid as a posture of fashionable desirability. This romanticization of tuberculosis, this strange and sorrowful beauty that the culture of the early 19th century found in the consumptive's gradual fading, was not, of course, the experience of the poor and the working class, who died of the disease in vast numbers in the crowded tenements of industrial cities, without the consolation of aesthetic celebration, whose deaths were recorded in the bills of mortality and in the workhouse registers, without any of the elegiac attention that surrounded the deaths of famous poets and musicians, and whose suffering was shaped not by an excess of artistic sensitivity, but by an excess of poverty, crowding, malnutrition, and cold. The gap between the romanticized consumption of the cultural imagination and the brutal demographic reality of tuberculosis in the industrial city was enormous. And it would take another generation or two of social reformers, sanitary engineers, and bacteriologists before the culture began to see the disease clearly as what it was, a product of poverty and crowding and shared air, rather than a mark of spiritual distinction. And even then, the old romantic associations did not vanish overnight, but lingered in the cultural atmosphere, like the soft sound of a bell that has been struck and is still, very faintly, resonating long after the striker has moved on. During this same period, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, physicians and natural philosophers across Europe were beginning to accumulate observations and arguments that pointed, with increasing insistence, toward the infectious nature of consumption, toward the idea that the disease was not merely a constitutional failing or a consequence of bad air in some vague atmospheric sense, but was caused by something specific and transmissible that passed from person to person, a living agent of some kind that could be caught and communicated. The way that smallpox could be caught and communicated, though the precise nature of this agent remained, for the time being, entirely mysterious. Among the early voices arguing for the contagious nature of tuberculosis was the Italian physician Giovanni Battista Morgagni, who in the 18th century performed detailed autopsies on individuals who had died of consumption and described the characteristic lesions he found in their lungs with great precision. The small, hard nodules that later scientists would call tubercles, from the Latin word for a small swelling or lump, and which would eventually give the disease its modern scientific name. The French physician René Laennec, who invented the stethoscope in 1816, a moment so gentle and so significant in the history of medicine that it deserves to be lingered over, stands as one of the central figures in the early scientific understanding of tuberculosis. For Laennec used his new instrument to listen to the lungs of thousands of patients, and in doing so was able to correlate with unprecedented precision the sounds he heard through the stethoscope with the changes he found in the lungs of those same patients when he examined them after death, building up a detailed picture of the progression of the disease, from its earliest stages to its final form, that transformed the clinical understanding of consumption in ways that persisted well into the era of bacteriology. Laennec himself suffered from tuberculosis and died of the disease in 1826, at the age of 45, in a terrible irony that did not escape those who knew and admired his work. The physician who had done more than perhaps any other to illuminate the clinical course of the disease, being himself taken by it before he could complete his life's work, and his death added another name to the long and sorrowful catalogue of physicians and scientists whose own bodies became, in a sense, part of the evidence they were studying. Meanwhile, in the early decades of the 19th century, a series of careful experiments by French and German physicians was accumulating evidence that consumption could be transmitted from one animal or person to another through some material means, with experiments performed by researchers, including the French physician Jean-Antoine Villemin, demonstrating in 1865 that inoculating guinea pigs with material taken from the lesions of human tuberculosis cases could cause the disease to develop in the previously healthy animals, a result of profound importance that established, for the first time on an experimental rather than merely observational basis, that tuberculosis was indeed a specific infectious disease caused by a specific transmissible agent, even though the nature of that agent would remain unknown for another 17 years. Villemin's work was not immediately or universally accepted, as is so often the case with findings that challenge the prevailing understanding, and a debate continued in the medical literature of Europe through the late 1860s and the 1870s about the fundamental nature of tuberculosis, with some physicians and researchers still arguing for a constitutional or environmental explanation of the disease's apparent clustering in families and in crowded conditions, and others, following Villemin's experimental lead, pressing the case for a specific infectious cause. It was into this atmosphere of lively and unresolved debate, in a small laboratory in the city of Berlin in the late 1870s and early 1880s, that a German country physician named Robert Koch was quietly assembling the tools and the methods and the evidence that would, on a single evening in March of 1882, resolve the question forever and change the course of medical history, and with it the course of the long slow story of tuberculosis and the human beings who had carried it through the millennia. Robert Koch was born on December 11th, 1843, in the town of Clausthal, in the Harz Mountains of Germany. The third of 13 children, in a family of modest means, and he grew up in the kind of rural, modest circumstances that gave no particular indication of the scientific revolution he would one day help to bring about, though those who knew him as a young man remembered a child of exceptional curiosity and patience, qualities that would prove, in the fullness of time, to be precisely what the science of bacteriology required. Koch studied medicine at the University of Göttingen, where he came under the influence of the anatomist Jacob Henle, who had written prophetically in 1840 about the possibility that contagious diseases might be caused by living organisms, a conceptual seed that would find its full flowering in the work of Koch's own laboratory. Decades later, and after completing his medical studies in 1866, Koch worked as a country doctor in a series of rural German practices, practicing medicine in the unhurried, practical way of a general practitioner, while beginning, in whatever spare time he could find, to pursue his deep interest in the microscopic study of disease. It was during his time as a district physician in Wolstein, in what is now Western Poland, that Koch first came to serious scientific attention, completing in 1876 a meticulous study of the anthrax bacillus, the organism responsible for the disease anthrax, demonstrating for the first time the full life cycle of a disease-causing bacterium, and establishing beyond reasonable doubt that a specific organism was responsible for a specific disease, a demonstration so thorough and so carefully executed that it established Koch's reputation as a scientist of the first order and brought him to the attention of the leading figures of German medicine. Koch brought to his scientific work a set of qualities that were both rare and essential: a phenomenal patience, a meticulous attention to technical detail, and an almost artistic sensitivity to the problem of making the invisible visible, of developing methods that would allow him to see clearly things that had never been seen before. And it was this last quality that proved decisive in his work on tuberculosis. Since the tubercle bacillus, the organism responsible for the disease, was exceptionally difficult to visualize under the microscope, using the staining techniques available at the time, requiring a new approach, a new combination of dyes and temperatures and timing that Koch developed through months of careful, unhurried experimentation. By early 1882, Koch had solved the staining problem, had developed a special blue alkaline dye that, when applied to tissue samples from tuberculous lesions at a carefully maintained temperature for a carefully maintained period of time, reliably stained the tubercle bacillus a distinctive color, while leaving the surrounding tissue essentially unstained, making the organism visible for the first time with the clarity that scientific proof requires. He had also developed, in collaboration with the botanist Ferdinand Cohn and others, methods for growing the organism outside the body, in pure culture on a special solidified growth medium, allowing him to isolate the organism, to study it, to reproduce it, and then to use it to infect healthy animals and produce the disease, completing the chain of evidence that would become enshrined in scientific history as Koch postulates, the criteria that must be satisfied to establish that a specific organism is the cause of a specific disease. On the evening of March 24th, 1882, Robert Koch stood before the Berlin Physiological Society and presented his findings, demonstrating with slides and cultures and the careful, measured language of a scientist who has spent years making certain that he is right before saying anything at all, that the cause of tuberculosis was a specific bacterium, the tubercle bacillus, later named Mycobacterium tuberculosis, and that this organism was responsible not only for pulmonary consumption, but for all the varied forms of the disease, including scrofula, Pott's disease of the spine, and the many other manifestations of tuberculosis in different organs and tissues of the body. The room in which Koch spoke was quiet. In the accounts of those who were present, with a quality of silence that comes when an audience has understood, all at once, that they are hearing something that will change the way the world works. And the physician and bacteriologist Paul Ehrlich, who was present that evening, later wrote that this night was the most important experience of his scientific life, that the calm, precise, unhurried way in which Koch laid out his evidence had the quality of a revelation delivered without drama, the truth arriving, not with a thunderclap, but with the quiet, steady certainty of morning light. The announcement that Koch made before the Berlin Physiological Society on the evening of March 24th, 1882, reverberated through the scientific and medical world of Europe and North America, with the particular force that belongs to discoveries that are both entirely new and yet, in retrospect, somehow inevitable, the kind of finding that makes everyone who hears it say, "Of course, yes, this must be how it is," even though no one had known it before. And within weeks of Koch's presentation, the major medical journals of Germany, France, and England were publishing accounts and commentaries on his work, physicians and researchers reading his paper, and beginning to consider what it meant for their understanding of the disease they had been treating, and in many cases dying of, all their professional lives. The paper in which Koch published his findings, titled Die Etiologie der Tuberkulose, or The Etiology of Tuberculosis, appeared in the Berliner Klinische Wochenschrift in April of 1882, and it remains, in the history of medicine, one of the most consequential scientific publications ever written, a document that brought to an end thousands of years of uncertainty and speculation about the nature of a disease that had caused more human death and suffering than perhaps any other single illness in the long span of recorded history. The immediate practical implications of Koch's discovery were, however, more complicated than the initial excitement suggested, for knowing the cause of tuberculosis was not the same as knowing how to prevent or cure it. And the years that followed 1882 saw intense scientific activity aimed at translating this fundamental discovery into something that could actually be used to help the millions of people who were still contracting and dying of the disease every year in the cities of Europe and America. Koch himself, aware of the expectations that had been placed on him by his extraordinary discovery, turned his attention to developing a treatment, and in 1890 he announced before the 10th International Medical Congress in Berlin that he had discovered a substance that he believed could arrest the development of tuberculosis in the body, a preparation made from a glycerin extract of the tubercle bacillus that he called tuberculin, and that he initially described with considerable, if carefully qualified, optimism. The announcement of tuberculin caused a sensation, bringing tens of thousands of patients to Berlin from across Europe and America in the hope of receiving the new treatment, and for a brief period in the early 1890s, it seemed to many observers that the conquest of tuberculosis was at hand, that the long story of the White Plague was approaching its final chapter. Koch had, however, been too hasty in his announcement, and tuberculin proved to be not the cure he had hoped it was. Its effects in clinical trials in patients with active tuberculosis being generally disappointing and in some cases actively harmful, causing severe reactions in patients who received it and accelerating, rather than arresting the progress of the disease in some individuals. The disappointment was profound, and Koch's reputation suffered considerably in the years that followed. Though tuberculin would eventually find an important role in medicine, not as a treatment, but as a diagnostic tool, since it was observed that individuals who had been exposed to tuberculosis mounted a characteristic skin reaction when injected with tuberculin, a reaction that could be used to identify those who had been infected, even in the absence of obvious symptoms, a principle that formed the basis of the tuberculin skin test, still used in modified form in tuberculosis screening programs around the world. Meanwhile, as Koch and other researchers struggled with the question of treatment, the public health responses to the discovery of tuberculosis's infectious nature were already beginning to transform the social landscape of the disease, bringing with them new ideas about contagion, new anxieties about infection, and new public health measures aimed at reducing the spread of a disease that, it was now understood, passed from person to person through the air in the invisible spray of coughed and breathed particles. In the decades that followed Koch's discovery, the sanatorium movement emerged as the dominant institutional response to tuberculosis across Europe and North America, a vast social and medical enterprise that at its height involved hundreds of institutions in dozens of countries, and that reflected in its architecture and its routines and its landscape a particular and rather beautiful theory about the relationship between the sick human body and the natural world around it. The origins of the sanatorium as an institution for the treatment of tuberculosis lay in the empirical observations of physicians in the middle decades of the 19th century, who had noted that some patients seemed to do better in certain environments, that the cool, dry, clear air of mountain regions appeared, in many cases, to slow the progress of the disease, that rest and good food, and time away from the crowded, smoky conditions of industrial cities, often produced improvement, at least temporary, in the health of consumptive patients. The German physician Hermann Bremer is generally credited with establishing the first purpose-built sanatorium for tuberculosis in 1854 in the mountain town of Gerbersdorf in Silesia, where he constructed an institution organized around the principles of fresh mountain air, a carefully regulated regimen of rest and graduated exercise, abundant and nourishing food, and the continuous medical supervision of patients in a setting removed from the conditions that had, it was believed, contributed to their illness. Bremer's institution and the theory behind it had attracted considerable interest in the European medical community, and in the years that followed, other physicians established similar institutions in other mountain locations, most famously in Davos, the Swiss alpine resort that became, in the latter half of the 19th century and the early decades of the 20th, the most celebrated of all tuberculosis sanatoria, and the setting that Thomas Mann would use as the backdrop for his great novel Der Zauberberg, published in 1924, a book in which the sanatorium itself becomes a kind of concentrated and slightly dreamlike world, a place removed from ordinary time, where the sick and the well mingle in a rarefied atmosphere of intellectual conversation, philosophical argument, and the ever-present awareness of mortality. In Britain, the sanatorium movement developed somewhat later, gathering momentum in the 1890s, following the establishment of the first British sanatorium at Nordrack-on-Mendip in Somerset in 1898, and by the early years of the 20th century, there were dozens of British sanatoria spread across the country, many of them situated in upland areas of Scotland, Wales, and the north of England, where the air was thought to be most conducive to recovery and where the patients could live their regulated outdoor lives at a careful remove from the cities that had in many cases made them ill. The daily routine of the sanatorium was, by the standards of ordinary life, remarkably slow and structured, organized around long hours of rest in the open air. The patients lying in their reclining chairs, on the verandas and terraces of the institution, wrapped in blankets, breathing the cold, clear mountain or highland air, reading, talking quietly, watching the seasons change in the landscape below them. And in this slow, regulated, outdoor existence, there was something that many patients found, alongside all the sorrow and uncertainty of their condition, genuinely beautiful and genuinely restful, a forced removal from the rushing pace of industrial life into something older and quieter, a life organized around the needs of the body and the rhythms of the natural world. And so, by the closing years of the 19th century, the long story of tuberculosis had arrived at a particular moment of transition, a moment poised between the old world of romanticized consumption and the new world of bacteriology and public health, between the dying beauty of the romantic vision of the consumptive artist and the emerging reality of the disease as a social and scientific problem capable of solution, between centuries of helplessness before a mystery and the first tentative steps toward genuine understanding and genuine intervention. The cities of Europe in the 1890s and the first decade of the 20th century were alive with a new kind of consciousness about tuberculosis, a consciousness shaped by Koch's discovery and by the public health campaigns that followed it, by the spread of the sanatorium movement, and by the growing understanding that the disease was not an inevitable fact of urban life, but a consequence of specific alterable conditions, of poverty and overcrowding, and poor nutrition and inadequate ventilation, conditions that could in principle be addressed by the combined action of physicians, social reformers, and governments willing to take the necessary steps. In England, the National Association for the Prevention of Consumption, founded in 1898, worked to educate the public about the infectious nature of the disease and to reduce the behaviors, particularly the habit of spitting in public places, that were now understood to facilitate its transmission, and local authorities in British cities began to establish tuberculosis dispensaries, where the poor could receive examination and advice without charge, the first steps toward a coordinated public health response to a disease that was still, at the turn of the century, claiming over 50,000 lives per year in England and Wales alone. In Germany and France and the United States, similar campaigns were underway, with tuberculosis societies, dispensaries, and public education efforts multiplying rapidly in the opening years of the 20th century, all animated by the new confidence that came from understanding the disease's cause, and from the belief, sincerely and widely held, that with sufficient effort and organization, tuberculosis could be brought under control and eventually eradicated. Robert Koch was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1905. The citation acknowledging his discoveries relating to tuberculosis, and in his Nobel lecture, he spoke with characteristic quietness and precision about the global burden of the disease and the work that remained to be done, knowing that the organism he had identified 23 years earlier in his Berlin laboratory was still killing millions of people around the world every year, and that the tools to defeat it definitively had not yet been found. Koch died on May 27, 1910, in Baden-Baden, at the age of 66, leaving behind a scientific legacy that had already, in the 28 years since his announcement before the Physiological Society, transformed the world's understanding of infectious disease and begun the slow, patient work of turning that understanding into the means of cure, a work that would continue for decades after his death, and that would ultimately, in 1943 and the years that followed, arrive at the discovery that Koch had always hoped for, the specific, reliable treatment that would, at last, begin to bring the White Plague under something approaching control. The night is quiet around you now, and the story of tuberculosis in these early centuries, and in this pivotal era of discovery, has been laid out gently, like pages turned slowly in a warm room. And the figures who have moved through it, the ancient physicians, the romantic poets, the patient bacteriologist in his Berlin laboratory, are all long at rest, their part in this long story completed. And the narrative moves on, as all narratives do, through the soft medium of time, carrying us forward with it toward the next chapter and the next, each one unfolding with the same unhurried pace, the same gentle accumulation of detail, the same quiet acknowledgement that the history of disease is always, in the end, the history of human beings trying to understand the world they find themselves in, and to make it by slow degrees, a little less sorrowful, a little more habitable, a little safer for the children who will come after. In the opening years of the 20th century, as the sanatorium movement spread its quiet architecture across the highlands of Europe and the mountain ranges of North America, the social understanding of tuberculosis was undergoing a transformation as profound, in its own way, as the bacteriological revolution that Koch had set in motion in 1882. A transformation that moved the disease from the realm of individual fate and constitutional weakness into the realm of social conditions, political responsibility, and the obligations that a civilized society owes to the most vulnerable of its members. The reformers and physicians and social theorists who drove this transformation were animated by a conviction that was in its essential character both scientific and moral. The conviction that tuberculosis was not something that simply happened to people, but something that was done to them by the conditions in which they were forced to live and work, by the poverty that made adequate nutrition impossible, by the overcrowding that made the sharing of infectious air inevitable, by the long hours in poorly ventilated factories and workshops that wore down the body's resistance and exposed workers hour after hour to the exhalations of their infected colleagues. The data that supported this conviction were, by the early years of the 20th century, extensive and compelling, drawn from the vital statistics that public health authorities in Britain, Germany, France, and the United States had been carefully collecting for several decades. Data showing with stark consistency that tuberculosis mortality rates were dramatically higher in the poorest districts of cities than in the wealthier neighborhoods, higher among those who labored in certain trades than among those who worked in the open air or in well-ventilated offices, higher in the industrial cities of the north of England than in the market towns and rural communities of the south, the geography of the disease mapping almost perfectly onto the geography of poverty and industrial labor. The English social reformer and physician Arthur Newsholme, who served as chief medical officer to the local government board from 1908, published a series of detailed statistical analyses of tuberculosis mortality in England and Wales that demonstrated this relationship between poverty and tuberculosis with meticulous care, arguing in his reports that the declining mortality from tuberculosis that had been observed since the middle of the 19th century, a decline that preceded Koch's discovery, and the development of any specific treatment was attributable primarily to improvements in the general standard of living, to better nutrition and less severe overcrowding, and that the most effective strategy for further reducing tuberculosis mortality was therefore not simply to treat the sick, but to address the social conditions that made the sick vulnerable in the first place. Meanwhile, in the United States, the journalist and social reformer Jacob Riis, whose 1890 book, How the Other Half Lives, had brought the conditions of New York tenement life to the attention of a wide middle-class readership, had identified tuberculosis as one of the central public health consequences of those conditions, describing the disease spreading through the dark, airless tenements of the Lower East Side, in language that was at once clinical and deeply compassionate, drawing the connection between crowded rooms, inadequate ventilation, and the quiet epidemic that was carrying away the children and young adults of the immigrant communities of New York at rates far higher than those of the prosperous neighborhoods a few miles uptown. In Germany, the growing tuberculosis awareness movement found a powerful institutional expression in the Deutsches Zentralkomitee zur Bekämpfung der Tuberkulose, the German Central Committee for the Control of Tuberculosis, founded in 1895 and supported by prominent physicians, social reformers, and members of the imperial government, which organized public education campaigns, supported the establishment of dispensaries and sanatoria, and pressed for the kinds of housing and workplace reforms that its founders believed were essential to reducing the burden of the disease. In France, the Comité National de Défense contre la Tuberculose, founded in 1899, undertook similar work, and the early years of the 20th century saw an international network of tuberculosis organizations, congresses, and campaigns taking shape, exchanging information across national boundaries, and sharing the conviction that what they were fighting was not merely a disease, but a social condition, a visible sign of the failure of industrial civilization to provide adequately for the bodies of the people who made its prosperity possible. The International Tuberculosis Congress met for the first time in Paris in 1888, bringing together physicians and researchers from across Europe and North America, and subsequent congresses in subsequent years became important forums for the exchange of scientific and public health knowledge about the disease, as well as occasions for the expression of the growing international consensus that tuberculosis control required action at the level of social policy as well as at the level of individual medical care. It is worth noting, as the night deepens around you, that this mobilization of social energy around a disease, this transformation of a medical problem into a political and moral cause, represents one of the earliest and most important examples in modern history of what we now call a public health movement, a collective effort to change the conditions that make populations vulnerable to disease, rather than simply to treat the individuals who have already become ill. And the tuberculosis campaigns of the early 20th century established patterns of advocacy, education, and policy engagement that would be followed by subsequent public health movements in the decades to come. Slowly, in cities across the industrializing world, the cumulative effect of these efforts began to be felt in the vital statistics as tuberculosis mortality rates, which had already been declining since the middle of the 19th century. As a result of improving living, standards continued their slow descent through the opening decades of the 20th century. not precipitously, not dramatically, but with the same patient, unhurried consistency that characterizes the best kind of social progress, the kind that is built not on a single intervention, but on the accumulated weight of many small improvements across many dimensions of ordinary life. During this same period of social mobilization and institutional response, the science of tuberculosis was advancing on multiple fronts, with researchers across Europe and North America working to understand more precisely how the disease was transmitted, how the body's immune system responded to infection, what distinguished those who became ill from those who, though exposed, remained healthy, and whether there might be some specific medical intervention that could supplement the general public health measures and the sanatorium regime to provide a more reliable means of prevention or treatment. The question of transmission was one of the first to receive systematic scientific attention in the years after Koch's discovery, and the German physician Karl Flügge conducted a series of careful experiments in the 1890s that demonstrated the role of fine airborne droplets, later called Flügge droplets in his honor, in the spread of respiratory infections, showing that bacteria could be suspended in the tiny particles of moisture expelled during coughing, sneezing, and speaking, and could remain viable in the air for long enough to be inhaled by persons at some distance from the source. Flügge's work, and the work of subsequent researchers who refined and extended his findings, established the basic model of airborne transmission that remains central to the understanding of tuberculosis today, though the precise dynamics of how infectious particles travel through air, how far they can travel, how long they remain viable under different conditions of temperature and humidity and ventilation, would continue to be refined by researchers throughout the 20th century and indeed into the 21st. The American physician Lawrence Flick, who was himself a tuberculosis survivor and who became one of the most energetic advocates for tuberculosis control in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, pressed the case for strict measures to prevent spitting in public places as one of the most important immediate steps that could be taken to reduce the spread of the disease. A campaign that led to the passage of anti-spitting ordinances in numerous American cities in the 1890s and early 1900s, among the first legal public health measures specifically targeting tuberculosis. Meanwhile, the question of why some people who were exposed to tuberculosis developed the disease while others did not was one that puzzled researchers and clinicians throughout this period, since it was by now well established that a large proportion of the urban population in industrial cities had been exposed to the tubercle bacillus, as demonstrated by the tuberculin skin test, and yet only a fraction developed active disease, a disparity that could not be explained simply by differences in exposure. The answer lay, at least in part, in the complex interplay between the virulence and dose of the infecting organism and the state of the host's immune defenses, a balance tipped toward disease by the conditions of poverty and overwork and malnutrition that compromised immune function, and tipped toward containment and latency in those whose bodies were better nourished and less worn down by the demands of industrial labor and urban poverty, a picture that emerged gradually from the accumulating evidence of clinical observation and laboratory experiment during the first decades of the 20th century. The question of vaccination against tuberculosis was also being actively pursued during this period, most importantly by the French bacteriologists Albert Calmette and Camille Guérin, who began their work at the Pasteur Institute in Lille around 1906, cultivating a strain of Mycobacterium bovis, the bovine form of the tuberculosis bacterium, on a special growth medium containing bile and passing it repeatedly through successive cultures over a period of 13 years, with the aim of producing a strain attenuated in virulence, weakened enough to be safe when introduced into the human body, but still capable of stimulating an immune response that would provide some protection against tuberculosis. The attenuated strain that Calmette and Guerin eventually produced was named after them, the Bacilli Calmette-Guerin, or BCG, and was first administered to a human being in July of 1921. A newborn infant in Paris whose mother had died of tuberculosis and who was therefore considered at high risk of contracting the disease. An event that marked the beginning of one of the longest and most complex chapters in the history of tuberculosis prevention. BCG vaccination would go on to become one of the most widely administered vaccines in the history of medicine, given to billions of people in the decades following its introduction, though its protective efficacy against pulmonary tuberculosis in adults would prove to be highly variable, differing substantially between populations and between geographic regions, in ways that researchers are still attempting to fully explain, while its protection against severe forms of tuberculosis in young children has been more consistently demonstrated. The atmosphere of the early 20th century was, in the realm of tuberculosis science and public health, one of cautious optimism tempered by the recognition of how much remained unknown and how vast the scale of the problem still was, the knowledge that the organism had been identified and its mode of transmission understood, sitting alongside the sober acknowledgement that millions of people were still dying of the disease every year, and that the specific, reliable treatment that would be needed to change this reality was still nowhere in sight, still somewhere in the future, waiting to be discovered by researchers who had not yet been born. The years of the First World War, from 1914 to 1918, and the years of social and economic dislocation that followed them, represented a significant setback in the slow progress that had been made against tuberculosis in the opening years of the 20th century, a reversal driven by the same mechanisms that had always driven tuberculosis: mortality upward, the crowding of large numbers of people into confined spaces, the deterioration of nutrition among civilian populations under the pressure of wartime food shortages, and the profound stress that war placed upon the bodies and immune systems of those who lived through it. The military camps and trenches of the First World War were environments of exceptional hazard for a respiratory pathogen like Mycobacterium, tuberculosis, bringing together men from all parts of their respective countries, many of whom carried latent infections acquired in the crowded industrial cities of their youth, and subjecting them to the cold and damp, and privation and respiratory stress of trench warfare, in a way that reactivated those latent infections and created new ones, spreading the disease through military populations at rates that alarmed the military medical authorities of all the combatant nations. The British military medical records from the First World War document a significant increase in tuberculosis cases among enlisted men, particularly in the later years of the war, when the general health of the army was most compromised by years of poor nutrition, inadequate rest, and exposure to the cold and wet of the Western Front. And similar patterns were observed in the French, German, and other combatant armies, the disease moving quietly through the military populations, alongside the more dramatic mass casualties of the trenches. Among the civilian populations of the combatant nations, particularly in Germany and Austria-Hungary, where the Allied naval blockade imposed severe food shortages from 1916 onward, tuberculosis mortality rose sharply during the war years, reversing the gradual decline of the previous decades and adding to the immense civilian death toll of a conflict that is primarily remembered for its military casualties, but that killed a very large number of people through disease, starvation, and the indirect consequences of economic disruption. The influenza pandemic of 1918 and 1919, which killed an estimated 50 million people worldwide, interacted with tuberculosis in particularly devastating ways, since the respiratory damage caused by influenza in survivors left their lungs more vulnerable to tuberculosis infection and reactivation, and the years immediately following the pandemic saw a marked increase in tuberculosis mortality in many countries. A secondary wave of death that followed in the wake of the more dramatic influenza catastrophe, and that is less often remembered, but was, in terms of its long-term toll, of considerable significance. Meanwhile, the years of economic depression that followed the First World War, and then, more acutely, the Great Depression of the 1930s, created social conditions almost as favorable to tuberculosis as the war itself had been, with unemployment, poverty, malnutrition, and the crowding of families into inadequate housing, all rising dramatically, and tuberculosis mortality responding, as it always had, to these deteriorating conditions. In the Soviet Union, which had inherited a tuberculosis problem of enormous proportions from the Russian Empire, and which was simultaneously dealing with the disruptions of revolution, civil war, and rapid industrialization, tuberculosis remained an acute public health crisis throughout the 1920s and 1930s, and the Soviet public health system mounted ambitious campaigns against the disease that combined BCG vaccination, sanatorium treatment, and the kind of sweeping social intervention that the Soviet model of centralized planning made, at least theoretically possible, with results that were difficult to assess, clearly given the political pressures on Soviet public health reporting. In the United States, the Great Depression drove tuberculosis mortality upward after a decade of steady decline, with rates rising in the early 1930s. As unemployment and poverty spread through the American population, a pattern that illustrated once again the fundamental connection between material living conditions and susceptibility to the disease that reformers had been pointing out since the beginning of the century. The interwar period, for all its setbacks and reversals, was also a time of genuine scientific progress in the understanding of tuberculosis, with advances in diagnostic techniques, including the widespread use of chest X-ray as a screening tool, improvements in surgical treatments for certain forms of the disease, and the continued refinement of the BCG vaccination program, all contributing to a gradually improving picture, even as the definitive pharmacological treatment that would be needed to truly turn the tide against the disease remained tantalizingly out of reach. Lying here in the darkness, it is perhaps something to notice, quietly, how the history of tuberculosis mirrors in miniature the broader history of human civilization in the 20th century, the same pattern of progress interrupted by catastrophe, and slowly reasserted the same long-term tendency toward improvement, built from the accumulated work of many hands over many years, punctuated by the reversals of war and depression and political upheaval, the long story moving forward, not in a straight line, but in the manner of all living things, with setbacks and recoveries, with periods of darkness and periods of light, moving always, in the end, however slowly, towards something better. In the quieter years between the two world wars, and particularly during the 1920s and 1930s, the tuberculosis sanatorium reached a kind of cultural and architectural apogee, becoming not merely a medical institution but a distinctive world unto itself. A world with its own rhythms and customs and social hierarchies, its own literature and art, its own particular relationship to time and to the body and to the natural world, a world that those who passed through it, whether as patients or as staff, often found difficult to explain to those who had not shared the experience, since the combination of enforced leisure, chronic illness, close community, and the ever-present awareness of mortality produced a quality of experience for which ordinary life provided few parallels. The architecture of the tuberculosis sanatorium was designed with a specific therapeutic purpose in mind, organized to maximize the exposure of patients to the open air and to sunlight, with the long verandas and south-facing terraces that became the most characteristic features of sanatorium design, serving as the places where patients spent much of their day, lying in their reclining chairs or deck chairs, bundled against the cold. If the sanatorium was in a highland or mountain location, breathing the outdoor air that was believed to be the primary agent of whatever therapeutic benefit the sanatorium could offer. The German-Swiss architect and engineer Johannes Dueker designed the Zonnestrahl Sanatorium in Hilversum in the Netherlands, completed in 1928 as an exercise in modernist architecture in the service of tuberculosis treatment, creating buildings of glass and concrete that open themselves to the air and light on all sides, whose transparency was not merely aesthetic but therapeutic, designed to ensure that the patients within them were as constantly exposed to natural light and circulating air as the exigencies of a European climate would allow, and Zonnestrahl became one of the most celebrated examples of the intersection of modernist architectural ambition and tuberculosis medicine that characterized this period. At Davos, in Switzerland, the famous resort town that had become the most celebrated of all tuberculosis destinations, the population of patients at any given time, during the height of the sanatorium era, included a remarkable cross-section of educated European society, wealthy enough to afford the considerable cost of a prolonged stay in a Swiss mountain sanatorium, and the cultural life that developed in this community of the educated and the ill-produced. Among other things, Thomas Mann's Der Zauberberg published in 1924 a novel whose protagonist, Hans Castorp, arrives at the Berghof Sanatorium in Davos for what he imagines will be a 3-week visit to a cousin, and finds himself drawn into the life of the institution so completely that he stays for 7 years. The novel itself enacting, in its extraordinary length and slowness and density of philosophical conversation, the particular temporal experience of the sanatorium, where ordinary time seemed to dissolve and be replaced by something slower, more contemplative, more aware of itself. The sanatorium was, for its patients, a place of profound ambivalence, simultaneously a refuge and a prison, a place of healing and a reminder of illness, a community of fellow sufferers that could be deeply sustaining, and a separation from the ordinary world of work and family that could be deeply painful. And the literature of the sanatorium era, which is extensive and emotionally rich, reflects this ambivalence with great honesty, the writers who produced it having lived through the experience themselves, or having known those who had. Among the British writers who spent time in tuberculosis sanatoria was the novelist and journalist George Orwell, born Eric Arthur Blair in 1903, who was diagnosed with tuberculosis in 1938. and who spent periods of his adult life in sanatorium care, an experience that shaped his understanding of illness and institutions and power in ways that are traceable in his later work, though he died of the disease in January of 1950 before. The antibiotic treatment that had just become available could save him. The American writer Catherine Ann Porter, who contracted tuberculosis in 1915 and spent time recovering in a sanatorium in Dallas, Texas, drew on the experience in her fiction, and the Irish writer Seamus O'Kelly died of tuberculosis in 1918, and the Welsh poet Edward Thomas, and the American poet Stephen Crane, and the catalogue of writers and artists whose lives were shaped or ended by the disease, continues through the early 20th century with a sorrowful persistence that speaks to how deeply tuberculosis was woven into the fabric of cultural life during this period. The nursing staff of the sanatoria occupied a position of particular complexity and particular dedication, living and working in close daily proximity to patients with an infectious disease, subject themselves to significant occupational risk of infection, and yet providing the kind of sustained, attentive care that the slow course of the disease required, care that was more than merely medical and that shaded, in the best sanatorium communities, into something closer to companionship and mutual support, slowly through the 1930s and 1940s. As the scientific understanding of tuberculosis deepened, and as new diagnostic and surgical techniques became available, the character of the sanatorium began to shift away from the pure rest cure of the earlier era towards something more actively medical, with surgical interventions including artificial pneumothorax, the deliberate collapse of an infected lung to rest it, and thoracoplasty, the removal of ribs to permanently collapse a diseased lung, being offered to patients whose disease did not respond to rest alone. Procedures that were, by any measure, severe, and that reflect the desperation of physicians confronting a disease for which they still lacked a reliable pharmacological treatment. The sanatorium world that reached its fullest expression in the 1920s and 1930s was, in the end, a world built on a foundation of improvised wisdom and careful observation, a world that offered the best that medicine could do in the absence of the specific knowledge it needed most. And it was a world that would begin to dissolve with remarkable speed in the years after 1943, when a discovery made in a laboratory in New Jersey would change everything, though the sanatoria themselves would linger on for another decade or two, gradually emptying as the new treatments made their long hospitalizations unnecessary, the buildings falling quiet, the verandas unoccupied, the reclining chairs removed and not replaced, the particular world of the sanatorium receding into history with the same slow and unhurried inevitability with which all worlds, in the end, recede. The story of the discovery of streptomycin, the first antibiotic effective against tuberculosis, is in its essential character a story of patience and method and collaboration across many years and many minds, the kind of story that does not lend itself easily to the drama of a single eureka moment, but must be understood instead as a slow accumulation of knowledge and technique, a long preparation that made the eventual discovery possible when the right person in the right place finally assembled all the pieces. The central figure in this story is Selman Abraham Waxman, a soil microbiologist born in the village of Novaya Priluka in the Ukraine in 1888, who emigrated to the United States in 1910, and built his scientific career at Rutgers University in New Jersey, where he spent decades studying the microorganisms that lived in soil, developing an expertise in the actinomycetes, a group of soil bacteria that he and his students had observed to produce substances that were toxic to other microorganisms, substances that would later be understood as natural antibiotics produced by soil bacteria as a competitive defense against other microorganisms in the dense microbial community of the soil. Waxman had been aware for many years of the curious observation made by various researchers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that Mycobacterium tuberculosis, the organism responsible for tuberculosis, seemed to survive very poorly in soil, disappearing much more rapidly when buried in earth than would be expected if it simply died from lack of nutrients, a pattern that suggested it was being destroyed by something in the soil environment, perhaps by one of the many microorganisms that competed for resources in that complex biological community. This observation provided a conceptual framework for Waxman's approach to the search for anti-tuberculosis agents. And through the late 1930s and early 1940s, his laboratory at Rutgers screened thousands of soil microorganisms for their ability to inhibit the growth of bacteria, developing systematic methods for this screening that produced, in 1943, the isolation of streptomycin from a strain of the soil bacterium, Streptomyces griseus, a substance that proved to be powerfully inhibitory to Mycobacterium tuberculosis in laboratory tests. And that would, within a few years, be demonstrated to be effective in treating tuberculosis in human patients. The isolation of streptomycin was the work not of Waxman alone, but of a team that included his doctoral student, Albert Schatz, a 23-year-old researcher who performed much of the practical laboratory work of the discovery, and the question of credit for the discovery would become the subject of a long and painful dispute between Waxman and Schatz that reflects the complex human dynamics of scientific credit and priority and institutional power. A dispute eventually settled through legal action in 1950, with Schatz receiving recognition as co-discoverer of streptomycin and a share of the royalties, while Waxman alone received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1952, the Nobel Committee choosing to recognize the broader body of work rather than the specific discovery. The clinical testing of streptomycin against tuberculosis was undertaken with unusual rigor and methodological care. The British Medical Research Council, organizing in 1946 and 1947, what is now recognized as one of the first randomized controlled clinical trials in medical history, assigning patients with pulmonary tuberculosis either to treatment with streptomycin or to a control group receiving the standard treatment of bed rest alone, and demonstrating with statistical precision that the streptomycin-treated patients showed significantly greater improvement. A study published in the British Medical Journal in 1948 that has since become a landmark in the history of clinical research, methodology as much as in the history of tuberculosis treatment. The results of the streptomycin trial were received with an excitement that was, for once, fully justified. The possibility of a true cure for tuberculosis, seeming to many physicians and patients to be one of the most significant moments in the long history of the disease, and the years of the late 1940s were filled with a genuine and reasonable optimisms about the prospect of bringing tuberculosis under control at last. However, this optimism was quickly tempered by the discovery of a phenomenon that would become one of the central challenges of tuberculosis treatment for the remainder of the 20th century and into the 21st, namely the ability of Mycobacterium tuberculosis to develop resistance to antibiotics, the organism evolving through the mechanisms of natural selection operating on its large populations. Strains that were no longer killed or inhibited by streptomycin, strains that arose with troubling rapidity in patients treated with streptomycin alone, and that could then be transmitted to other people, creating the possibility of an epidemic of drug-resistant tuberculosis that would, in some parts of the world and in some decades, approach precisely that fearsome reality. The solution to the drug resistance problem, which was recognized essentially immediately after the first clinical use of streptomycin, and which represented an urgent medical challenge, came through the development and combination of additional anti-tuberculosis drugs, most importantly para-aminosalicylic acid, or PAS, introduced in 1946, and isoniazid, introduced in 1952. The combination of multiple drugs attacking the organism through several different mechanisms, simultaneously, and making the development of resistance to all drugs at once far less likely than resistance to any single drug, establishing the principle of combination therapy that has remained the foundation of tuberculosis treatment ever since. As the 1950s began, the landscape of tuberculosis treatment had been transformed in a period of less than a decade, from one in which no specific pharmacological treatment existed to one in which a combination of effective drugs was available, and the implications of this transformation for the sanatoria and for the broader social response to the disease were beginning to be felt. The long hospitalizations that had been the only available response to tuberculosis beginning to seem unnecessary and economically unjustifiable, as outpatient drug therapy proved capable of achieving the same results at far lower cost and with far less disruption to patients' lives. The world that tuberculosis had been shaping for centuries was beginning, at last, to reshape itself in response to the tools that science had finally provided. Though the full implications of this transformation and the new challenges it would bring in its wake were still unfolding as the middle of the 20th century arrived. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, the decline of tuberculosis in the wealthy industrialized nations of the world was dramatic and sustained. The combination of effective drug treatment, improving living standards, and continued public health efforts producing mortality reductions of a magnitude that would have seemed almost miraculous to the physicians of even a generation earlier, the rates falling year after year, with a consistency that seemed to justify the cautious optimisms of those who believed that tuberculosis might, within a generation or two, be effectively eliminated from the countries that had the resources to mount a comprehensive control program. In England and Wales, tuberculosis mortality fell from approximately 50,000 deaths per year at the turn of the century to fewer than 5,000 by 1960. And in the United States, the decline was similarly striking, with tuberculosis dropping from the leading cause of death to a relatively minor cause over the course of 5 decades. A transformation achieved through the combined effect of improved living conditions, BCG vaccination in some populations, the introduction of effective drug treatment, and the gradual dismantling of the conditions of poverty and overcrowding that had driven the epidemic of the industrial era. The sanatoria of Europe and North America emptied with remarkable speed during the 1950s. Patients who would previously have faced years of institutional care being discharged after months of outpatient drug treatment, the great buildings that had been constructed with such care and at such expense to provide the rest cure of the pre-antibiotic era finding themselves without patients to house and without a therapeutic purpose to serve. Many of them being converted to other uses as schools and hotels and conference centers and retirement homes, or simply being closed and left to the slow processes of decay, their empty verandas and unoccupied terraces gradually being reclaimed by the landscape that had always surrounded them. The emotional experience of this transition, for those who lived through it as patients or as sanatorium staff, had a quality of disorientation that is captured in some of the memoirs and literary works of the period. The world of the sanatorium, which had been so complete and so self-contained and so carefully organized around the rhythms of illness and recovery, dissolving almost overnight into memory and nostalgia. The particular community of the sick and the healers dispersing back into ordinary life with the speed that only a medical revolution can produce. Meanwhile, in the developing world, in the countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, the picture was very different. Tuberculosis remaining an acute and devastating public health problem throughout the 1950s and 1960s and beyond. The improvements in living standards that had driven the decline in the wealthy countries being absent, drug treatment being available, but often not accessible to the poorest and most vulnerable populations, and the disease continuing to kill hundreds of thousands of people every year in communities that had not benefited from the social and economic improvements that had transformed the epidemic in Europe and North America. The World Health Organization, founded in 1948, identified tuberculosis as one of its primary public health priorities from its earliest years, and through the 1950s and 1960s undertook large-scale BCG vaccination campaigns in many developing countries, as well as programs to make effective drug treatment more widely available, with results that were meaningful but that fell short of what was needed to bring the global epidemic under control. In the absence of the deeper social and economic changes that had driven the decline in wealthier nations, the drug regimens used to treat tuberculosis in this period were themselves challenging, requiring patients to take multiple medications daily for periods of 12 to 24 months, a demanding commitment that posed serious problems of adherence in populations where access to healthcare was limited, where the stigma of tuberculosis was still severe, and where the practical difficulties of obtaining medications regularly over such a long period were substantial. And the problem of treatment non-adherence and the drug resistance that followed from it became one of the central challenges of tuberculosis control in the developing world and would remain so for decades. In 1966, researchers demonstrated that certain drug combinations, particularly those including rifampicin, which had been introduced in 1963, could shorten the required duration of tuberculosis treatment dramatically, eventually permitting the development of the 6-month short-course chemotherapy regimen that became the standard of care in the 1980s and 1990s, a regimen involving 4 drugs in the initial phase and 2 drugs in the continuation phase that proved capable of curing the great majority of drug-susceptible tuberculosis cases when taken consistently and in full, though the challenge of ensuring that patients did indeed take all their medication consistently for the full 6 months remained formidable. The social history of tuberculosis in the post-war decades is, in many ways, a story of 2 worlds. The wealthy world in which the disease was declining toward near elimination and beginning to be forgotten, and the poorer world in which it remained a major cause of death and suffering, and in which the promise of the new drug treatments was only partially fulfilled by the realities of healthcare access and economic constraint, a divergence that would persist, and in some respects, deepen through the late 20th century, before being confronted with new urgency by the crises of the 1980s and 1990s. that brought tuberculosis back to the attention of the world. The night is long and soft around you, and the story of tuberculosis's great retreat and its stubborn persistence in the poorer parts of the world is itself a kind of lullaby of human effort and human limitation, the slow progress of medicine and public health, running always against the slower but equally patient pressures of poverty and inequality, the same forces that had driven the epidemic of the industrial era, taking new forms in the post-war world, and continuing their quiet work and the long story of the disease that began in the mummified bodies of ancient Egypt, moving forward through the decades of the 20th century with the same unhurried pace that has always characterized it, advancing where conditions favored it, and retreating where they did not, waiting with the patience of a very old and very experienced organisms for whatever opportunities the changing world of human beings might provide. The 1980s arrived with a quality of quiet confidence in the wealthy nations of the world regarding tuberculosis, a disease that had, in those countries, been declining so consistently for so long that it had begun to recede from the foreground of public health concern into something more like a historical memory, a disease of the past, of the Victorian slum, and the sanatorium veranda, and the romantic poet's deathbed, a disease that modern medicine had essentially solved, and that required only the continued application of existing tools to be reduced, in time, to insignificance. This confidence, which was not entirely without foundation, given the dramatic declines in tuberculosis incidence that had been achieved in Europe, North America, and Australia since the introduction of effective drug treatment in the late 1940s and early 1950s, would prove, however, to be premature, and the decade of the 1980s would bring with it a series of developments that would rudely interrupt the long decline and demonstrate, with a clarity that was deeply sobering, that tuberculosis had not been defeated but only suppressed, and that the conditions necessary for its resurgence were never very far from being assembled. The first and most devastating of these developments was the emergence of the human immunodeficiency virus, HIV, and the acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, AIDS, which began to be recognized as a distinct clinical entity in the early 1980s, and which would prove to be, in its relationship to tuberculosis, a catastrophe of the first order, since the primary mechanism by which HIV causes death is the destruction of the immune system's capacity to control infections that a healthy immune system handles without difficulty, and among the infections most immediately and most dangerously released. By this destruction of immune competence is latent tuberculosis, the vast reservoir of contained infection that exists in the bodies of the estimated 1/3 of the world's population, who have been exposed to Mycobacterium tuberculosis, but whose immune systems have kept the organism dormant and harmless. In persons infected with HIV, this immune suppression transforms latent tuberculosis infection into active disease at a rate dramatically higher than in immunocompetent individuals. The lifetime risk of developing active tuberculosis in a person with latent infection rising from approximately 10% in the immunocompetent to as high as 10% per year in persons with HIV infection, a difference of such magnitude that it effectively created a new tuberculosis epidemic within the existing HIV epidemic, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where both infections were most prevalent and where the healthcare systems were least equipped to respond. In the countries of sub-Saharan Africa, the intersection of HIV and tuberculosis produced mortality statistics that were heartbreaking in their scale and in their pace, tuberculosis becoming the leading cause of death among people with AIDS in Africa and in many other parts of the developing world. The two diseases amplifying each other in a vicious cycle in which HIV increased susceptibility to tuberculosis and tuberculosis, through the inflammatory response it provoked, appeared to accelerate the progression of HIV disease, each infection making the other more dangerous and more difficult to treat. Meanwhile, in the United States and other wealthy countries, the HIV epidemic drove a resurgence of tuberculosis that interrupted and temporarily reversed the long decline, with tuberculosis cases in the United States rising from a low of 22,201 reported cases in 1985 to a high of 26,673 in 1992, an increase that was concentrated in urban areas and in populations heavily affected by HIV, by poverty, and by homelessness, the disease returning to the same neighborhoods and the same social conditions that had characterized it a century earlier. The geography of the resurgence mapping, once again, with painful precision, onto the geography of social disadvantage. The New York City tuberculosis outbreak of the late 1980s and early 1990s was particularly alarming, both for its scale and for a feature that distinguished it sharply from the tuberculosis outbreaks of previous generations, namely, the high proportion of cases involving strains of Mycobacterium tuberculosis that were resistant not to one, but to multiple antibiotics, strains that had evolved through the mechanisms of natural selection in a healthcare environment characterized by incomplete and interrupted treatment, where patients who began drug regimens did not always complete them, where the conditions of homelessness and poverty and addiction made consistent treatment difficult to sustain, and where the consequences of that inconsistency were borne not only by the individual patient, but by all those who were subsequently infected with the resistant strains that the inconsistent treatment had allowed to develop. The emergence of multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, or MDR-TB, defined as tuberculosis resistant to at least the two most important first-line drugs, isoniazid and rifampicin, represented a qualitative as well as a quantitative change in the nature of the tuberculosis problem, since MDR-TB required treatment with second-line drugs that were more expensive, more toxic, less effective, and required to be taken for much longer periods than the standard 6-month regimen, transforming what had been a manageable and relatively inexpensive public health challenge into something far more demanding and far more costly, and raising the spectre of strains resistant to all available drugs, a spectre that would, in subsequent decades, cease to be merely speculative. The response to the New York City MDR-TB outbreak included the introduction of directly observed therapy, or DOT, a strategy in which healthcare workers directly observed patients taking their medications, ensuring that each dose was actually consumed rather than merely prescribed, a strategy that proved effective in improving treatment completion rates and reducing the spread of drug-resistant strains. And that was subsequently adopted as a global standard of tuberculosis treatment by the World Health Organization in its DOTS strategy, introduced in the early 1990s. It is worth noting, as the long night of this history continues its gentle passage, that the story of the 1980s tuberculosis resurgence is in many ways the same story as the story of the original tuberculosis epidemic of the industrial era, the same essential relationship between social vulnerability and infectious disease, the same pattern of a pathogen finding its opportunities in the conditions of poverty and crowding and compromised immunity, the same need for social as well as medical responses. The same reminder that no disease can be considered conquered as long as the conditions that favor it continue to exist anywhere in the world. The decade of the 1990s was one of growing international recognition of tuberculosis as a global emergency, a recognition that had been delayed by the decades of optimism in wealthy countries, but that was now, in the face of the HIV-related resurgence and the emergence of drug resistance, impossible to defer any longer, and the World Health Organization's declaration in 1993 that tuberculosis constituted a global health emergency was both a statement of fact and a call to action, an acknowledgement that the disease that had been retreating in the wealthy world while advancing in the poor had never, in fact, been brought under global control, and that the tools that had produced such dramatic results in some settings were failing to reach the populations that needed them most. The DOT strategy that the World Health Organization formally endorsed and promoted through the 1990s represented, in essence, a synthesis of the most effective elements of tuberculosis control as they had been developed and tested over the preceding decades, combining accurate diagnosis through sputum microscopy, standardized short-course chemotherapy, a consistent supply of drugs, a system of supervision and monitoring of treatment, and government commitment to the entire program, the 5 elements being considered necessary, not individually, but in combination, each one supporting the others in the complex system that effective tuberculosis control requires. The implementation of DOTS across the developing world through the 1990s and 2000s produced genuine and measurable improvements in treatment success rates in many countries, with the global treatment success rate for new cases of drug-susceptible tuberculosis reaching approximately 85% in countries with well-functioning DOTS programs, a result that, while imperfect, represented an enormous improvement over the treatment outcomes that had been achieved in the absence of systematic supervision and support. However, the emergence of extensively drug-resistant tuberculosis, or XDR-TB, first formally characterized in a study published in 2006 that analyzed tuberculosis strains from multiple countries and found a substantial proportion resistant, not only to the first-line drugs, but also to the most important classes of second-line drugs, represented a challenge that the DOTS strategy was not designed to meet, requiring new approaches, new drugs, and new levels of investment in tuberculosis research and development that had been conspicuously absent through the preceding decades. The global response to drug-resistant tuberculosis required the development of new diagnostic tools capable of rapidly identifying resistant strains, since the traditional culture-based methods of drug susceptibility testing required weeks to produce results, during which time patients were either untreated or treated with ineffective regimens, and the development of molecular diagnostic techniques that could identify resistance, conferring genetic mutations in tuberculosis bacteria within hours rather than weeks, represented a significant technological advance that began to change the management of drug-resistant tuberculosis. From the mid-2000s onward, the GeneXpert MTB RIF assay, developed by researchers at the University of California, San Francisco, and commercialized by Cepheid, received World Health Organization endorsement in 2010 and represented a particular breakthrough capable of simultaneously detecting Mycobacterium tuberculosis and resistance to rifampicin in a sputum sample within 2 hours, using a cartridge-based automated system that could be operated by relatively untrained personnel, and that was eventually deployed in thousands of healthcare facilities in high-burden countries, transforming the capacity for rapid diagnosis in settings where it had previously been most limited. Meanwhile, the pharmaceutical pipeline for new tuberculosis drugs, which had been essentially empty for decades, began in the 2000s to show signs of life, driven partly by the increasing urgency of the drug resistance problem, and partly by new mechanisms of research funding and public-private partnership that brought pharmaceutical and academic researchers together in ways that the fragmented and underfunded tuberculosis research landscape had previously made difficult. The drug bedaquiline, developed by Johnson & Johnson and approved by the United States Food and Drug Administration in 2012, under its accelerated approval pathway, was the first drug with a new mechanism of action to be approved for tuberculosis treatment in more than 40 years, targeting the mycobacterial ATP synthase enzyme in a way that was entirely different from all previously available tuberculosis drugs, and that proved effective against many strains of multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. Its approval representing a moment of genuine progress in the long and difficult effort to develop new tools against a disease that had been neglected by pharmaceutical research for far too long. The 1990s and 2000s were also decades of growing attention to the social dimensions of tuberculosis vulnerability, with researchers and public health practitioners accumulating evidence that the risk of tuberculosis was not distributed randomly through populations, but was concentrated in those most marginalized by poverty, by displacement, by imprisonment, by substance use, and by the various forms of social exclusion that compromise both the material conditions of life and the access to healthcare that effective tuberculosis control requires. Findings that reinforced, in the language and framework of 21st century public health, the argument that reformers and social physicians had been making since the beginning of the 20th century, that addressing tuberculosis requires addressing the social conditions in which it thrives. At the turn of the 21st century, the global burden of tuberculosis remained immense by any measure, with the World Health Organization estimating that approximately 8 million people were developing active tuberculosis disease each year, and that nearly 2 million were dying of it annually, making tuberculosis the leading infectious disease killer in the world. After the period during which HIV-related tuberculosis deaths briefly elevated the combined toll to extraordinary levels, and the geographic distribution of this burden was strikingly unequal, with approximately 80% of cases occurring in 22 countries, most of them in Asia and Africa, countries in which the combination of high background rates of infection, inadequate healthcare infrastructure, poverty, and in many cases, high HIV prevalence created conditions that tuberculosis exploited with its customary patience and persistence. India carried the single largest share of the global tuberculosis burden, accounting for approximately 1/4 of all new tuberculosis cases worldwide, a reflection of both the country's enormous population and the social and economic conditions that, despite dramatic improvements in many dimensions of Indian life, still left a large proportion of the population vulnerable to infectious disease, and the Indian government's revised National Tuberculosis Control Program, established in the 1990s and subsequently reformed and expanded, represented one of the largest national tuberculosis control efforts in the world, facing challenges of scale and diversity and healthcare system capacity that had no counterpart elsewhere. In China, where rapid economic development had transformed many dimensions of public health, tuberculosis remained a significant problem, through the early years of the 21st century, with an estimated 100,000 or more deaths per year, and a prevalence of drug-resistant strains that reflected the difficult history of tuberculosis treatment in a country that had undergone such profound social disruptions over the preceding century. The countries of sub-Saharan Africa continued to bear a disproportionate share of the global tuberculosis burden, particularly in the context of the HIV epidemic, with countries like South Africa, which had one of the highest HIV prevalence rates in the world, also having some of the highest tuberculosis incidence rates. And the XDR-TB outbreak documented in Tugela Ferry in KwaZulu-Natal province in 2006, in which nearly all of a cohort of 53 patients died within a short time of diagnosis, most of them also HIV positive, and with very limited access to effective treatment, became one of the defining public health events of the decade, a demonstration of what drug-resistant tuberculosis could do in a population with high HIV prevalence and inadequate healthcare resources. The Stop TB Partnership, a global coalition of governments, international organizations, donors, and civil society groups established in 2000, brought a new level of coordination and political commitment to the global tuberculosis response. And the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis and Malaria, established in 2002, provided a new and significant source of financing for tuberculosis control in high-burden countries, making available resources on a scale that national health budgets in the poorest affected countries could not have generated alone. The NTB strategy adopted by the World Health Assembly in 2014 set ambitious targets for reducing tuberculosis incidence and mortality by 2030, calling for a 90% reduction in tuberculosis deaths and an 80% reduction in tuberculosis incidence, compared with 2015 baseline figures, targets that represented a genuine aspiration toward ending the global tuberculosis epidemic, but that, in the assessment of most experts, required levels of investment into tuberculosis research, healthcare systems, and social protection that had not yet been committed. The relationship between tuberculosis and poverty, which had been the central theme of the social medicine tradition since the beginning of the 20th century, was by the early 21st century supported by an extensive body of epidemiological evidence demonstrating that the risk of tuberculosis was closely associated with markers of material deprivation at every level of analysis, from the individual to the household, to the community, to the national, and that the most powerful determinants of tuberculosis incidence at the population level were not primarily medical, but social and economic. The same insight that Arthur Newsholm and Herman Biggs and the other social physicians of the early 20th century had advanced, now expressed in the quantitative language of modern epidemiology. The COVID-19 pandemic, which began to spread globally in early 2020, represented yet another interruption of the slow progress against tuberculosis, disrupting healthcare services across the world, diverting resources and attention away from tuberculosis control programs, and causing significant increases in the number of undiagnosed and untreated tuberculosis cases in many high-burden countries, with the World Health Organization reporting in 2021 that the number of tuberculosis deaths had increased for the first time in more than a decade, a reversal that was attributed primarily to the disruptions caused by the pandemic response, rather than to any change in the underlying epidemiology of the disease. As the third decade of the 21st century began, the global tuberculosis situation could be described, in the careful language of public health, as one of cautious progress, interrupted by significant challenges. The long-term trend toward reduced incidence and mortality, continuing in most regions, but being threatened by drug resistance, by the social determinants of vulnerability that remained inadequately addressed, and by the periodic disruptions that accompany the emergence of new health crises. In a world whose public health systems were stretched thin across many competing demands, the history of how scientists and physicians came to understand the immunology of tuberculosis, the intricate and fascinating story of how the human immune system encounters Mycobacterium tuberculosis and responds to it, is one of the most complex and scientifically rich chapters in the entire history of the disease, a story that has unfolded gradually over more than a century of research, and that is still, in many of its details, actively being written by researchers working in laboratories and clinics around the world. Robert Koch's tuberculin, the glycerin extract of the tubercle bacillus that he had hoped would be a treatment, and that proved instead to be a diagnostic tool, was the first indication that the immune response to tuberculosis was something more complex than a simple battle between invading organism and defending body, since the dramatic inflammatory reaction that tuberculin provoked in previously infected individuals, a reaction quite different from the mild or absent response of those who had never been exposed, suggested that prior infection had left some lasting alteration in the immune system state, a readiness or a sensitization that affected how it responded to subsequent encounter with the organism. The Austrian-American immunologist Clemens von Pirquet, working in Vienna in the early years of the 20th century, used the tuberculin reaction as one of the central examples in his development of the concept of allergy, which he defined as a changed or altered reactivity of the immune system resulting from prior contact with a foreign substance, and his tuberculin skin test, which he described in 1907, and which measured the skin's delayed inflammatory response to injected tuberculin as an indicator of prior tuberculosis exposure, became one of the most widely used diagnostic tools in the history of medicine, employed in tuberculosis screening programs around the world for more than a century, and still in use today, alongside its more modern molecular successor, the interferon gamma release assay. The understanding of why only a minority of those infected with Mycobacterium tuberculosis develop active disease, while the majority contain the infection in a latent state for the remainder of their lives, has been one of the central questions of tuberculosis immunology for the past century, and the answer that has emerged from decades of research involves a complex interplay of innate and adaptive immune responses, involving macrophages, which are the primary cells that engulf and attempt to destroy invading bacteria, T lymphocytes of various types, natural killer cells, and a range of signaling molecules, including the cytokines, that coordinate communication between immune cells, all working together to contain the organism within structures called granulomas, tight clusters of immune cells that wall off the bacteria and prevent their spread. The granuloma, a structure visible under the microscope in the tissues of tuberculosis patients, and the entity from which the disease takes its modern name, is itself a subject of great scientific interest, representing the immune system's primary strategy for containing a pathogen that it cannot eliminate, and research in recent decades has revealed the granuloma to be not a static containment structure, but a dynamic and continuously contested space in which the balance between immune control and bacterial growth is maintained through an ongoing molecular negotiation, a balance that can be tipped toward bacterial growth by conditions that compromise immune function, and that can, under the right circumstances, last for decades without being fully resolved in either direction. The development of tumor necrosis factor inhibitors, a class of drugs used to treat autoimmune conditions, including rheumatoid arthritis and Crohn's disease, by blocking the activity of the cytokine. Tumor necrosis factor alpha revealed with particular clarity the importance of this cytokine in maintaining the integrity of tuberculosis granulomas, since patients treated with these drugs showed a dramatically increased risk of tuberculosis reactivation, demonstrating that tumor necrosis factor alpha was essential to the immune control of latent infection and providing both a warning about the safe use of these drugs in populations with high tuberculosis exposure and a window into the molecular mechanisms of granuloma maintenance. The search for a better tuberculosis vaccine than BCG has been one of the major goals of tuberculosis research for several decades, motivated by the recognition that BCG, while providing consistent protection against severe tuberculosis in young children, offers variable and often inadequate protection against pulmonary tuberculosis in adolescents and adults, the population that accounts for the majority of tuberculosis transmission, and by the hope that a more effective vaccine could transform the global tuberculosis situation in the way that effective vaccines have transformed the situations of other infectious diseases. Several vaccine candidates have advanced into large-scale clinical trials in the first decades of the 21st century, including the M72 AS01E candidate, developed by GlaxoSmithKline and the Bill and Melinda Gates Medical Research Institute, which showed, in a phase 2 trial published in 2019, approximately 50% efficacy against active pulmonary tuberculosis in adults with latent tuberculosis infection in sub-Saharan Africa, a result that fell short of what had been hoped, but that was nevertheless the most promising result seen in tuberculosis vaccine research in many decades, and that provided a foundation for further development. The immunological complexity of tuberculosis, the way in which the organism has evolved over millennia of coexistence with the human immune system to exploit its mechanisms and evade its defenses, is itself a kind of testament to the extraordinary duration of the relationship between this disease and our species, a relationship so long and so intimate that the organism has become, in a sense, deeply knowledgeable about its host, familiar with the defenses it will encounter and equipped through thousands of generations of natural selection, with the means to circumvent them, at least partially, at least long enough to establish itself and find its way to the next host. The quietness of all this immunological activity, the drama of the battle between mycobacterium and immune system being played out entirely at the level of individual cells and molecules, invisible to the person in whose body it is occurring, is itself one of the most remarkable features of the disease. The fact that most infected people never know they carry the organism, never feel its presence, live out their entire lives with a latent infection that their immune system contains, without effort and without awareness, is a kind of biological peace treaty between species, an accommodation reached over thousands of years of coexistence, and it is only when the terms of that accommodation are disturbed by poverty or malnutrition or age or immunosuppression or any of the other conditions that tilt the balance toward the bacterium, that the peace breaks and the old familiar illness asserts itself once again. The cultural legacy of tuberculosis in the modern world is both deeper and stranger than the disease's current epidemiological profile in wealthy countries might suggest. The traces of centuries of intimate acquaintance with the White Plague visible in literature and art, and music and fashion, and social thought in ways that persist long after the disease itself has ceased to be a daily presence in the lives of most people in the countries where it once dominated the mortality statistics. The vast literature of tuberculosis, the poems and novels and memoirs and letters produced by those who experienced the disease directly or who mourned those it took, constitutes one of the richest bodies of writing on any single medical subject in the history of Western letters, ranging from the letters of John Keats to his beloved Fanny Brawne, written during his final illness with a tenderness and a sorrow and a beauty of expression that have never been surpassed, to Thomas Mann's great sanatorium novel, Der Zauberberg, to the autobiographical writings of George Orwell and Catherine Mansfield and Maxim Gorky, and so many others who lived and wrote in the long shadow of the disease. Catherine Mansfield, the New Zealand-born short story writer who died of tuberculosis in France in January of 1923, at the age of 34, left behind in her journals and letters an account of living with the disease that is among the most honest and most moving in the entire literature of illness. Her writing, capturing the particular quality of existence under the constant awareness of mortality, with a precision and a grace that transcend the specific historical circumstances of her illness, and speak to the universal experience of facing one's own finitude with open eyes. The influence of tuberculosis on the visual arts of the 19th and early 20th centuries was also profound. The image of the consumptive appearing in the paintings of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood in England, in the drawings and illustrations of Victorian periodicals, in the photographic portraits of the dying, that were a distinctive feature of Victorian mourning culture, the pale, thin, beautiful, reclining figure that the disease produced having become, by the middle of the 19th century, one of the most recognizable aesthetic types in Western visual culture, an image that carried with it a whole freight of associations related to sensitivity, spirituality, femininity, and the fragile boundary between life and death. The fashion history of tuberculosis, which the historian Carolyn Day explored in her 2017 book, Consumptive Chic, is one of the more unexpected dimensions of the disease's cultural legacy, her research demonstrating the degree to which the physical appearance of the consumptive, the pallor, the thinness, the elongated neck and sloping shoulders, produced by the disease's characteristic progression, shaped the beauty ideals and fashion practices of middle and upper class women. In the first half of the 19th century, women adopting the appearance of illness as a mark of social distinction and refinement, in ways that, from the perspective of the 21st century, seem both poignant and deeply strange. The musical legacy of tuberculosis includes not only the works of Chopin, whose tuberculosis is audible, some have argued, in the particularly intimate and introspective quality of his late piano music, but also those of Schubert, who may have suffered from tuberculosis alongside syphilis in his last years, and of Carl Maria von Weber, and of the many lesser-known composers and musicians whose careers were shortened or shaped by the disease. The musical life of the 19th century, being so thoroughly permeated by tuberculosis that it is impossible to fully separate the music of the era from the medical reality that surrounded its creation. In the realm of popular culture, the romantic associations of tuberculosis persisted well into the 20th century. The thin, pale, coughing romantic heroine appearing in operas, including Verdi's La Traviata, based on Alexandre Dumas' fifth novel La Dame or Camélias, and Puccini's La Bohème, both of which feature young women dying of consumption as their emotional and dramatic center, and both of which continue to be performed regularly in opera houses around the world. The consumptive heroine's death, still capable of moving audiences to tears, more than a century after the disease it depicts, has ceased to be the common fate it once was. The stigma of tuberculosis, which had developed alongside the romantic associations, but which intensified dramatically after Koch's discovery made the infectious nature of the disease widely known, represents a darker dimension of the cultural legacy, one that persisted through the 20th century, and that continues, in various forms, to affect those with the disease in high-burden countries today. The fear of contagion and the association of tuberculosis with poverty and social marginalization, creating barriers to diagnosis seeking and treatment adherence that public health practitioners continue to work to dismantle. It is a gentle and somewhat melancholy thing to observe, at this distance, how a disease that killed so many people across so many centuries has left behind it a cultural legacy of such complexity and such richness, as though the suffering and the dying and the long, slow acquaintance with mortality that tuberculosis imposed on so many generations had been transmuted through the alchemy of artistic creation into something of enduring beauty. The poems and the music and the novels remaining long after the illness that inspired them has, in the wealthiest parts of the world at least, become a memory. As the second decade of the 21st century unfolded, and the world moved deeper into an era of accelerating medical and scientific progress, the research landscape for tuberculosis was transformed in ways that offered genuine reason for optimism, even as the scale of the remaining challenge continued to demand humility and sustained commitment. The combination of new diagnostic tools, new drug regimens, vaccine candidates in advanced clinical trials, and a deepening understanding of the biology of the organism and the host's response to it, creating a sense among those working in the field that the tools to end the global tuberculosis epidemic were, for perhaps the first time, within reach, though the distance between being within reach and actually grasping them remained, as it always had, formidable. The development of new all-oral drug regimens for multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, made possible by the approval of bedaquiline and delamanid, and subsequently by the development of the BPAL regimen, combining bedaquiline, pretomanid, and lianzalid, which the TB Alliance's NIX-TB and Xenix clinical trials demonstrated, could cure a high proportion of even the most extensively drug-resistant tuberculosis cases in a 6 to 9 month course of treatment, represented one of the most significant advances in tuberculosis treatment since the introduction of rifampicin, offering for the first time a genuinely promising treatment for patients who had previously faced extremely limited prospects. The World Health Organization's updated guidelines on drug-resistant tuberculosis treatment, issued in 2018 and subsequently revised, reflected these advances by recommending the shift to fully oral regimens and by updating the classification of tuberculosis drugs based on current evidence of efficacy and safety, changes that were implemented with varying speed and completeness across different national programs, but that reflected a genuine modernization of the clinical approach to the most difficult forms of the disease. The broader tuberculosis research community in the 2010s and 2020s was animated by a vision of what the field called the end DBB era, an aspiration toward the elimination of tuberculosis as a public health problem, defined as fewer than one case per million population per year in low-incidence countries by 2035 and globally by 2050, timelines that were ambitious, but that reflected the genuine advances in available tools and the growing political and financial commitment to tuberculosis control that had been built up over the preceding 2 decades. The COVID-19 pandemic, which disrupted tuberculosis services globally from 2020 onward, was in some respects also a catalyst for tuberculosis research, since the enormous global investment in vaccine development, diagnostic technology, and antiviral drug research that the pandemic prompted produced technological advances, including novel vaccine platforms such as the mRNA technology used in COVID-19 vaccines, that researchers immediately began to explore for their potential application to tuberculosis, the same platform that had produced effective COVID-19 vaccines in less than a year, being recognized as offering a potentially transformative approach to the long-standing challenge of tuberculosis vaccine development. The tuberculosis research community entered the 2020s with a pipeline of vaccine candidates more extensive and more scientifically diverse than at any previous time in the history of the field, with multiple candidates in phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials, exploring different antigenic targets, different adjuvants, different delivery platforms, and different vaccination strategies, including both prophylactic vaccines intended to prevent infection in uninfected individuals and therapeutic vaccines intended to enhance the immune response of those already infected. The social and political dimensions of the tuberculosis response continued to be as important as the scientific ones, with the global tuberculosis community increasingly emphasizing the need for social protection measures, including nutritional support, income transfers, and housing assistance for tuberculosis patients, as essential components of effective tuberculosis control programs. Evidence accumulating from several countries that these social support interventions could significantly improve treatment outcomes by addressing the material conditions that made adherence to treatment difficult and that left the immune system compromised. In India, the government's commitment to a tuberculosis-free India by 2025, a target more ambitious than the global end TB timeline, drove significant investments in tuberculosis programs, including the expansion of molecular diagnostics, the introduction of newer drug regimens, and the Nikshay Poshan Yojana nutritional support scheme for tuberculosis patients. Though the COVID-19 pandemic set back the progress that had been achieved and pushed the timeline for the ambitious elimination target beyond its original horizon, the history of tuberculosis in the early 21st century is, in many ways, the history of a transition still in progress, a transition from a world in which tuberculosis was an essentially uncontrollable epidemic, driven by the conditions of poverty and crowding and immune vulnerability, to a world in which the scientific and public health tools to end the epidemic exist and are being progressively deployed, a transition whose completion requires not only the continued development and delivery of those tools, but also the deeper social and economic transformations that have always been, at the most fundamental level, the most powerful determinants of who gets sick and who does not, of who lives and who dies in the long, patient story of this ancient and persistent disease. And so we arrive at last at the present moment, at the place where this long history brings us to a world in which Mycobacterium tuberculosis has been the companion of the human species for at least 9,000 years, perhaps much longer. A world in which the organism that caused the wasting of ancient Egyptians and the phthisis of the Hippocratic corpus and the consumption of the Romantic era and the white plague of the industrial city is still present, still infecting, still causing illness and death in communities around the world. And yet, a world in which the understanding of the disease, the tools to diagnose and treat it, and the commitment to end it are all more advanced than they have ever been at any point in the long history that stretches between us and those ancient mummified remains in the sand of the Nile Valley. The physician who sits today in a clinic in Johannesburg or Mumbai or Manila, diagnosing tuberculosis with a molecular test that returns results in 2 hours, prescribing a drug regimen that will cure most patients in 6 months, following the guidance of international protocols refined over decades of carefully conducted clinical research, inhabits a world almost incomprehensibly distant from the world of the Hippocratic physician who listened to a patient's chest and recommended rest and clean air and nourishing food. And yet there is a continuity of care and of concern that runs unbroken through all those centuries of observation and effort and grief. The same fundamental orientation of the physician toward the suffering person before them, the same desire to help and to heal and to understand, persisting through all the changes of knowledge and technology and social context that separate those ancient practitioners from their modern successors. The reformers and social physicians who understood in the 19th and early 20th centuries that tuberculosis was a disease of poverty and overcrowding, and that its conquest required social as well as medical transformation, were not wrong. And the evidence of the 21st century continues to confirm what they intuited from the patterns they observed, that the distribution of disease in a population is the truest mirror of the distribution of social justice, and that the path to a world free of tuberculosis runs through the elimination of the poverty and marginalization, and inadequate housing, and nutrition that leave people vulnerable, a path that is longer and more demanding than the path of drug development alone, but that leads, in the end, to something more durable and more complete. The artists and poets who found in tuberculosis a dark and complicated beauty, who transmuted the suffering of the consumptive into some of the most enduring works in the Western cultural tradition, were responding to something real in the experience of the disease. The way it slowed time, the way it made the ordinary world both more precious and more distant, the way it forced upon its sufferers a kind of attentiveness to their own mortality that ordinary health allows most people to avoid, and the cultural legacy they left behind, the poems and novels and operas and paintings, speaks across the centuries to the universal human condition of fragility and finitude that tuberculosis so starkly illuminated. The millions of people who lived and died with tuberculosis across the millennia of this history, whose names are mostly lost to the record, who coughed through the nights of ancient cities and industrial tenements and sanatorium wards, who sat on verandas breathing mountain air and wrote letters to those they loved, and faced the slow diminishment of their strength with whatever courage and resignation and grief they could muster, were not footnotes to the history of medicine, but its substance, the real content of all the statistics and case reports and clinical trials, the human reality that all the science and all the policy and all the public health work was ultimately in service of, and their suffering and their endurance and the care they received and failed to receive are part of the long, slow, unfinished story of what it means to be a species that heals imperfectly and persistently across the centuries. The world tonight is quiet, as it always is at this hour, and the history of tuberculosis, which is in so many ways the history of human beings living closely together in the imperfect conditions of human civilization has been laid gently before you in these long hours of narration. The ancient physicians and the romantic poets and the patient bacteriologists and the social reformers and the sanatorium architects and the clinical trialists all taking their places in the long procession of those who encountered this disease and tried, in the ways available to them, to understand it and to ease its burden. And here you are, safe in the quiet of your room, your body warm and at rest, your breathing slow and even, the history of all those centuries settling softly around you. Like the pages of an old book, gently closed, the candlelight of the past extinguished one by one, the distant tolling of church bells fading back into silence, the scratch of quills and the cough of the sick, and the careful voices of physicians measuring their words, all receding into the great distance of time, and what remains is simply this moment, this breath, this gentle darkness, this body of yours at rest and at peace, breathing slowly in a world that is, by the slow and patient work of countless human hands, across countless human generations, a little safer and a little more hopeful than the world came before it. Let the past drift away now, softly, softly, and let the quiet of the present hold you, as it does, as it always does, as you breathe and rest and sleep.